how have we created a system collectively as civilization in which one person has this much power? What does it mean when one person can, move markets with something they tweet in between walking from the kitchen to the living room? Or what does it mean when one person can arguably affect the outcome of an election because of their enthusiastic immersion in the campaigning process?
Hello, and welcome to Equals, the podcast about inequality. I'm Annie.
And I'm Grazielli. Welcome. In this episode, we ask, what if figures like Elon Musk are not outliers, but signals of a deeper transformation in capitalism, technology, and power?
In today's episode, we're going to explore the topic of Muskism. We're going to try to understand Elon Musk and the world he intends to make. We're going to look into the worlds that made Elon Musk and that are now making ours.
From satellites to social media, from AI to energy systems, we ask, what happens when governments and all of us become deeply dependent on tech monopolies? And more importantly, can this model be challenged?
And our guests today are the co-authors of a new book called Muskism, A Guide for the Perplexed. Joining us are Quinn Slobodian and Ben Tarnoff. Let's dive in. Quinn and Ben, you both have recently published a book called Muskism, which looks at Elon Musk, explores him less as an individual and more as a symptom of our new post-liberal age. Can you start for our listeners by outlining the main arguments and observations that your book makes, and also what the benefits are of shifting our perception, I would say, from Musk, the man, to the movement?
Sure. Well, perhaps the best starting point for thinking about what we are trying to achieve with the book is to look back at the example of Henry Ford, the famous American industrialist, best known for building the Ford Motor Company. And commentators of the last century came up with a concept called Fordism. And they did so by looking at the life and work of Henry Ford and inferring or extrapolating a broader social system. Ford himself didn't consider himself a Fordist. He wouldn't have thought precisely in those terms. But it was possible to look at the themes over the course of his career and develop out of them a particular way of organizing production, but also a particular way of organizing society that, according to social scientists, really came to define industrial capitalism in the middle of the 20th century. So when we first contemplated doing this project, Quinn and I asked ourselves, what kind of world are we living in now? Who would be the prime representative of this period of capitalism? And could we infer an ism from the life and work of that person? And of course, the individual who came to mind was Elon Musk. And the concept we were curious about trying to extrapolate from his life and work was Muskism. And Muskism is a very different way of organizing society than Fordism. We define it briefly as the promise of sovereignty through technology, the promise that in an increasingly unstable world, both individuals and nation states can fortify their self-reliance by plugging into the infrastructures of a monopoly private provider, such as those offered by Musk. And we can get into greater detail about what precisely we mean by that. But that gives you a kind of broad sense of our aspiration here, less in trying to precisely get at the root of why Musk does what he does, which is, of course, in some fundamental sense, unknowable, but more zooming out and trying to ask this bigger question of what is the meaning of Musk? What kind of society produced Musk, and what kind of society is he himself producing?
And the second part of my question, I just want to get back to it. What would be the benefits from shifting our perception of him as a man, which, I mean, everybody talks about him all the time. So is it possible, do you think, for people to understand this as a movement, as you were saying, Fordism?
Yeah, I mean, we have had a kind of arc ourselves moving from, I would say, a suspicion of the virtue of focusing on one person. So I think both of us had been aware of Musk's, of course, incredible wealth and his importance in our present moment of digital capitalism for some years. And yet there's a real temptation, I would say, to kind of mute him, right? Just to forget about him, focus on what seem like the more important things, what forms of grassroots mobilization are coming into coalescence. How can we think about structures and larger forces rather than personalities? So it seemed for us for a long time that focusing on individual was was what could be a bit of a trap or even kind of a political diversion or a distraction. But at some point, at the moment especially when he came into the government as a special government employee, helping to lead Doge, and the scope of his ambition seemed not to be slowing down. In fact, it was accelerating. Then there was something that we felt was necessary to try to understand, which is, how have we created a system collectively as civilization in which one person has this much power? What does it mean when one person can, move markets with something they tweet in between walking from the kitchen to the living room? Or what does it mean when one person can arguably affect the outcome of an election because of their enthusiastic immersion in the campaigning process? What does it mean when stock markets, upon which a lot of people rely, not just the wealthy, we're talking about pension funds, not even just in the United States, but really all over the world, seem to rest on the kind of fabulism and sometimes, deranged speculations about the future that someone like Musk is constantly spouting out. So we thought, and we feel that we pulled it off to a greater or lesser extent in the book, that you could tell a different story about the 21st century, really, through the figure of Musk, in which you get to the big changes. You get to the attempts at green capitalism. You get to the rise of China as a near peer economic superpower to the United States. You get to, above all, the overwhelming importance of digital capitalism and a few small big tech firms in propping up the growth model for the industrial North, and in some ways now even the rising powers like India and China as well. So it was a kind of a narrative choice for us that we could draw people in a way with the figure of Musk, only to kind of then pull back the lens and explain to the readers that, a Musk is only possible under a certain set of circumstances. And to understand those circumstances is to understand something much broader than the man himself.
And it's interesting that you're talking now about these social culture forces that produced Musk. And it seems like that these same forces are pushing us towards a less human future. Do you understand this way? And why did you feel that the time was right for this book? And what can be done to course correct?
That's, I think, 3 questions, so I'll try to take them in order. The first, I think, helps clarify why we focus on Musk. I think we really think about Musk as someone who is absorbing, remixing, and radicalizing broader social forces and kind of presenting them back to us in an exaggerated, distorted form that help us actually see them more clearly, that there's a real pedagogical value to Musk. And I bring that up in the context of your question because, when we think about a post-human future, this is something we talk a lot about in the book. Musk himself is very focused on the need for what he describes as a becoming cyborg, that he wants people to accelerate their fusion with the machines, that he wants to further augment human mind and body with cybernetic technologies, that he wants to vastly accelerate the automation of human labor through both robotics and LLMs. And it's easy to psychologize this set of beliefs, to attribute them to a fascination with cyberpunk science fiction, to write them off as delusions. But in fact, once again, here Musk is really an indicator species for a broader phenomenon. I mean, for decades now, we've lived under the accelerating digitization of everyday life, which in turn has been the primary growth model for American capitalism in the form of big tech and, by extension, global capitalism. And now that development is accelerating even further under the banner of AI. So I think, Musk, and in our view, Muskism is oriented towards a post-human future, but this is drawing on developments that have been continuing for decades at this point. I think this, perhaps jumping ahead to the question of what could be done about it. I mean, I think I'd be curious for Quinn's thoughts here. There's kind of 2 ways to approach this question, right? There's the question of how Musk's own power might be confronted, and then there's this, I think, somewhat trickier question about how to reckon with this ensemble of forces that we're diagnosing as Muskism. I think when it comes to Musk's own power, we've had an opportunity to spend about 10 days touring a handful of European countries talking about this book. And, a major theme in our conversations was the need for European governments in particular to reduce their reliance on Musk's companies. So there are important efforts underway to develop independent launch capacity so that if the Austrians or the Spanish or whoever want to put a satellite up into low Earth orbit, they don't have to pay SpaceX for the privilege. There's also relatedly efforts to expand the number of low Earth satellites that a company like Eutelsat, a French provider, has so that it can start to compete with Starlink. So I think there's various efforts that we could point to of ways that nation states and individuals are attempting to reduce their reliance on these companies of Musk. There's also, the kind of broader question of Muskism. And I think for us, this is a somewhat trickier question because to the extent that we're trying to describe an ensemble of social forces such as rapid digitization, such as increasing deglobalization, these are developments, these are trends that are likely to continue in one form or another, even if Musk himself disappears from the historical stage. So Muskism has a life beyond Musk, and I think it has to be thought about in much more expansive ways.
I think also to tag on to that, for some time now, thinking about especially the audience for this podcast and the kind of important work that, say, Oxfam has been doing, tracking inequality and the rise of the global billionaire class, there has been an attractive solution, let's say, since around the global financial crisis and the impunity with which the people who oversaw the collapse of many people's livelihoods were able to, have no consequences. And on the contrary, to see their wealth rise ever more, something that also happened through the containment measures for the global pandemic in 2020, in which the number of millionaires and billionaires continued to multiply across the world, even as inequality grew. And for a long time, I think for, critical academics, leftist observers, probably a lot of people who, tune in to Oxfam podcasts, there was a simple and elegant argument, which was to simply tax the billionaires, right? To close the loopholes that they're using to hide their corporate profits overseas, to make it harder to use these kind of arbitrage of the complicated spider web of tax havens and legal chicanery to make the world more of a socially just place. One of the things I think we found attractive because of its complexity about the question of Muskism is it's not quite that easy in this case, right? What we're trying to point to is not just, I think, the kind of plutocracy that comes with skimming off, excessive fees as the manager of a hedge fund or as an institutional investor. What we're interested in is the way that the structural dependencies that someone like Musk oversees are really woven into people's everyday lives, right? It's not just financial witchcraft. It is the means of constructing something like a digital public sphere, right? Twitter was extremely disproportionately important, especially because in raw numbers, not that many people used it ever compared to your Facebook. But the people who used it were disproportionately influential in shaping public opinion. So it's where journalists went to catch the pulse of the nation or the world. It's where politicians would try out new messages. And when Musk purchased that platform, just to use this as one example, he was given the chance to subvert the operations of even a minimally functional version of a digital public sphere by boosting his own messages, by monetizing the system such that his own fans would be given priority in people's feeds, and then of course more recently by really making it into the platform to organize a kind of far-right international through his repetition and reposting of incendiary phrases from his partner far-right ideologues around the world. So to use that as one example, we could also talk, as Ben did, about the launch capacity of SpaceX and its reliance for putting satellites for communications or espionage and security into low Earth orbit. You could also talk about what had been for a while a kind of chokehold on the consumer electric vehicle market, which has now, of course, been broken in many countries that are allowing BYD to sell their vehicles. But in the United States, he really does still have that near monopoly on EVs for consumers. So in confronting the problem of Musk, I think it's a little bit harder than just the kind of Rutger Bregman, like, let's go tax the billionaires. It's done. Easy. Like, hard to do, but the slogan is simple. It's actually not that easy in the case of Musk. It's like, how do you unwind a series of vulnerabilities which are now built into our ways of organizing society, organizing infrastructure. Consider the fact that Tesla Energy has just received a contract to provide energy in the UK through their microgrids and energy storage systems. This is a much harder kind of material problem of oligarch rule that is not a fiscal problem, but it's like a physical problem, right? It's a material problem. And as Ben said, there's a couple of options. You can either regulate, as the UK and EU do. You can replace, so you can try to make your own, European version of social media, or you can try to reinvent. And this is where we hope to lead the reader by the end of our book, is that there is something that is a deeper problem here, which needs to be confronted, which is the fact that, as Musk makes very clear to us, and he has no interest in downplaying, tech is political. These are not just neutral algorithms. They are not just neutral devices. They are not just even neutral semiconductors. These things are all coming with them a set of organizing social relations, a set of organizing who profits and who doesn't, and in some cases, what kind of politics are going to be more likely than other kinds of politics. So I think in the best case scenario, we use Musk and Muskism in this kind of pedagogical form to, alert people to the depth of the problem and then prompt them, hopefully, to more far-reaching reconsiderations of the patterns of everyday life.
We were talking before the interview started. I had asked you if it was your first book you've written together, and you've said yes, but you've both done research and written separately before. When you've researched and written about how neoliberalism and the far right are intertwined, how do you see Muskism as connected to that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's one I thought a lot about in embarking on this project, because much of what I've done over the last decade has been directly related to, as you say, the history of neoliberalism and trying to pin down what that is and come to a kind of helpful way to introduce a reader, whether academic or non-academic, to this topic. And there are kind of the core texts of neoliberalism. There are its most prominent thinkers. And in that sense, you can study neoliberalism the way other people study conservatism or anarchism, by looking at the most influential philosophers of those movements and figure out how they inspired affiliated movement, social movements, and how and if they influenced politicians. And there was a big question, I would say, on the minds of academics and leftist kind of observers about what the relationship was between neoliberalism to the kind of power of big tech leaders such as Elon Musk that we are now, very much in the middle of. Are they neoliberals? Is it something different? Is this post-neoliberalism, et cetera, et cetera? And I think my answer to that would be, and I would say we follow that implicitly and explicitly in our book, is that someone like Musk, and by extension the big tech leadership class, are very much products of the neoliberal era, right? They grew to power in an era in which the public authorities, in the United States especially, more and more kind of delegated the role of innovation to the private sector. And even if they were backing them up, with all kinds of state-funded technology, including the internet itself, of course, there was at least rhetorically a belief that, real change would come from the private sector and business leaders. And the role of government was to kind of facilitate that. So in a way, they're products, they're children of neoliberalism, but ideologically, they seem to part very much from it. So even if they retain their love for light touch regulation or the ability to create intellectual and material monopolies, they still have a different way of thinking about what they're doing. The sharpest way to explain that would be something we very much get into in the book, which is someone like Musk is actually not an individualist per se, right? He doesn't actually build much of his system around the idea of individual freedom. Rather, he's a systemic thinker. So he thinks about building out networks, and specifically digitally coded networks in which humans become pieces of the code base that he says quite directly can be either programmed or in negative conditions be contaminated with what he calls mind viruses. So this is pretty far from traditional neoliberalism, which was very anti-socialist in its origin, was very much against thinking about the totality and the whole, or planning at that level, was very much about heroic entrepreneurs and individualism at some levels. So at the level of the thought and ideology, was important for Ben and I was to say Musk doesn't get his ideas really from his science fiction novels, even if he likes to cite them a lot. He actually really gets his ideology mostly from the conduct of business. So he's a capitalist. He spends his day running his firms. He spends his day thinking about profit margins and cutting payroll and getting productivity up. And so what would it be like not to go back to the sacred texts of someone like Milton Friedman to understand him, even if he posts about him once in a while, but to think about the practice of the working day as the stuff out of which his ism has been made. The same way, indeed, people understood Fordism, not by carefully studying his memoir, even though they would read it, but by carefully studying the factory floor and the exchange between the consumer and the worker that was being reformatted by Ford, and the hierarchical worldview that he actually embraced, which is in some ways similar to Musk.
Wow, that's a bit shocking too. And I would like to give an example to try to move us in the direction of looking on alternatives and solutions, because it's heavy, the diagnostic you bring to us. I remember when Musk bought Twitter, and the first thing I thought was, well, I'm just going to leave this place and go to blue sky and everything will be okay. But that didn't happen, because I lost all the important connections I needed from my work and from that influencing space. And I didn't get it in another place. So it just felt like those who were in this space of the Twitter and that were trying to push an agenda towards equality, human rights, they were just leaving and the space was open for other things. This example is just to go to the real question about governments. We now see that governments are completely dependent of Musk and other techno billionaires on many areas, including health, where all the data of health is with them. And from the night to the day, they can simply reduce data or sell data that are so private for people. How could governments defend their sovereignty from those tech billionaires and from this power they have today?
So this is a dynamic we get into in great detail in the book, and we talk about it in terms of state symbiosis. We think Musk actually demonstrates this dynamic very clearly in his businesses, particularly through SpaceX, but of course it's a broader phenomenon of the kind you allude to, which is the extent to which governments and private actors, in particular private tech companies, have formed a symbiotic relationship in which increasingly states cannot exercise core sovereign functions without purchasing services to do so from a monopoly private provider. And the case of SpaceX is kind of paradigmatic here, right? When the US military wants to conduct operations, or the Ukrainian military for that matter, they have to rely on Musk. They have to rely on private infrastructures provided by Musk. So there is, in fact, a kind of dialectical relationship here between sovereignty and dependency, that states are receiving something in return, typically, that they are receiving a kind of expanded capacity for the exercise of sovereignty that is being delivered to them through these new technologies. But the cost of that is, if you like, what we call sovereignty as a service, that sovereignty has to be purchased on a subscription basis through increments from a private provider. I would say, the obvious solution, easier said than done, is for states to build independent capacity, independent of the private sector, and to, if required, they will draw on private services, but to have those private providers be in a subordinated role. You can see again expressions and kind of efforts towards reasserting a degree of sovereignty, for instance, in the European examples that I mentioned a moment ago. I think this Trump administration has given policymakers around the world a much more urgent understanding of how they need to reduce their reliance on not just the United States, but specifically Silicon Valley tech firms. And there are various initiatives around so-called digital sovereignty toward that end. I think on the one hand, my answer would be we need to affirm the need to restore a degree of independent state capacity and acknowledge that the decision to hollow out the state and plug private providers into the back end of government was a political choice, and we can make different political choices. But we also, I think, need to be wary of the various regressive forms that such efforts could take.
I'd like to ask you one more question. The struggle against big tech can oftentimes, I would say for me, like David going up against Goliath. What gives you hope that we might be able to take down these giants and reclaim the rights and the freedoms that have been eroded along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been doing our best to float some bright spots, right, through the course of this conversation. Like, to go to the example of X.com, I get that people feel like they lose their contacts and their accumulated communicative capacity when they sign off of that platform. But the fact is, it's been changed in such a way now to make that communicative capacity almost nil anyway. Blue Sky is not as good, obviously. It doesn't have the reach, it doesn't have the diversity, but it is happening at a smaller scale. Look at normal regulation. Musk's X offices were raided in Paris last month. It was egg on his face. Their European Commission has levied over €1 million fine against X.com, and they've actually changed their provisioning of the platform because of a result of that. So there's replacement, there's regulation, those things are real. And don't forget, I think always, that Musk's wealth is entirely bound up in his two companies, SpaceX and Tesla. And if those things don't fulfill their outrageous promises, if they don't get humanoid robots strolling around the Earth pretty soon, if they don't get orbital AI data centers circling the planet pretty soon, then the institutional investors will start to lose their faith, and his value falls as his company's values fall. He knows that. That's why he's so erratic. That's why he's making these big bets. That's why he's impulsively trying to, dangle the keys and shake them in front of the baby's face that is our public attention as much as possible to distract us from his underlying vulnerability and fragility. So I think that's the best way we can see this, is actually they rely for their power on us giving them their patronage and using their services. We can withdraw those. The thing that I would caution is that we need to realize that because this outrageous valuation that sits at the basis of all of their companies is the load-bearing infrastructure of the global financial system, that if Musk goes to zero and Nvidia goes to zero and Meta goes to zero, you get a recession, right? So we need to be ready for that. We need to figure out how demand works, how alternative forms of value creation and value redistribution work, and not just think it's a matter of, killing Goliath and everything's okay. Actually, the real trouble comes after Goliath is dead.
Thanks.
Thank you both so much.
Thanks, guys.
What an alarming episode. For me, one big takeaway is this. We are not just facing powerful individuals, we are facing systems that shape how we live, communicate, and the governments. And that means the solution can't stop at outrage or even taxation. They require rethinking infrastructure, rebuilding public capacity, and reclaiming democratic control over technology. And for you, what stood out, Annie?
Yeah, it was a really interesting conversation. I think scary for me sometimes too, and I'm just left with so many questions about, what do we want machines and AI for? Who's going to own them? How are we going to make them work for us, for people? How is it going to further divide societies, political division, inequality? And I think they do a really great analysis. And, I think they made a great point at the end about, we're thinking, okay, we're going to kill Goliath and everything's going to be okay. But the real trouble actually comes once he's dead. What do we do? What next? And yeah, I'm just left with a lot of questions. I'm going to be thinking about this one for a long time.
Yes, absolutely. So many questions. And one big one is not only how to regulate big tech, but how to reduce our dependence on it. And to support us making this analysis, we have here with us our colleague, Hana Ivanhoe.
Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about social media and AI and how it has a huge part to play in shaping not just the modern day United States where Hana lives, but also the world as we know it today. Hana, I want to start by asking you about this. Is there a world in which these technologies could actually lead to greater autonomy and inequality for everyday people? What do we do after we kill Goliath? Or I guess we should start thinking about it much before then. What do you think?
Certainly, there is a world in which these technologies, in particular AI, including generative AI, can lead to greater economic equality, greater prosperity for all. I think certainly the idea of tech for good and AI for good, AI for development, it's not an oxymoron, right? It's not fundamentally unachievable. Unfortunately, that is not at all the track that we are on right now. I think in order for that to be the case, new and emerging technologies, including in particular AI and generative AI, must be designed, developed, deployed, and used in a manner that is responsible, safe, and above all, rights respecting. And there simply are not the processes and policies, frankly, being put in place today at either governmental or company levels, like, say, human rights due diligence, to ensure that that would be the case.
Hannah, and who loses out in this road of Muskism and deepening inequality? And what do you think they can do to reclaim their power?
I think that's a great question. I think certainly it is those groups that are already marginalized, right? That have maybe less, it seems, bargaining or negotiating power vis-a-vis policymakers, and in particular the companies themselves, right? Who are most likely to lose out, who are losing out. Those are generally workers and, women of color largely, right? We see those same folks who are so often on the losing end of so many deals, unfortunately, in a position where they're being further subjugated by the introduction of these technologies, the way that they are being designed, developed, and then introduced in these populations. In terms of what they can do to reclaim their power, I think it's going to be up to worker organizations and organizations like ours, civil society organizations, working hand in hand with them to ensure that policymakers take the right steps and ultimately to get those companies to make better decisions to ensure that their products are more rights respecting.
Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
If you like this episode, please share. You can follow us on X, on Blue Sky, at equals hope. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at equals.inc, INK. And find us on your favorite platform for listening to podcasts.
Thank you for listening and speak soon.
Bye.